So just things like that, people, were always willing to, lend a hand.
You can almost identify Angus Young, the one in the schoolboy uniform, the one with the duck walk, and the one whose guitar seems like it wants to light the stage on fire. However, what if the stage version didn't reflect reality? Imagining a profound stillness that surpasses any encore, lurking underneath each enthralling solo. This isn't only the story of a legendary rock star. It's also the story of a young man who was never given the chance to truly shine, a sibling who continued to perform music even after their loved one's health declined, and a house that mysteriously disappeared. What remains when all the flash and glamour has faded is something far more tragic and humane than ego or glamour. Angus Young came into this world in the murky aftermath of World War II in Glasgow. Once the crown jewel of British industry, the city has crumbled into a collection of run-down areas bound together by grit rather than optimism, as well as soot-stained buildings and defunct industries. Angus was born into a family of 8 siblings, and being the youngest, he had to learn to put his imagination ahead of reality and put survival ahead of comfort. As one of many overcrowded families, the Youngs endured a broken heater, no fridge, and occasionally little more than a shared bed in their cramped home at 6 Scarivore Road in Cranhill, a working-class neighborhood. Life was raw, unfiltered, and unforgivingly hard. The chill wasn't simply in the air. The atmosphere was rife with violence. Kids had to toughen up or get beaten in schoolyards, which were more than simply places to play. Childhood wasn't just challenging, it was combative for someone as physically little and introverted as Angus. Fights were regular, bullying was cruel, and the environment was hostile. His father, an ex-engineer in the Royal Air Force, did everything it needed to put food on the table, including working odd jobs as a postal carrier and in factories. Even with her unassuming fortitude, his mother, Margaret, kept her children safe from the worst that the city had to offer. However, no amount of love could save them from the crushing poverty and lack of hope that pervaded the city. Music, like light around shattered shutters, trickled through the impoverishment as this extraordinary event unfolded. Even when they were starving, the Young home was never silent. George and Malcolm, 2 of Angus's elder brothers, filled the confined spaces with their melodies, accompanied by guitar chords, radio static, and distant dreams of a better life. Before the family could afford a real guitar, George would restring an old banjo and give it to Angus as a first guitar for him to play. Angus sought solace in the crude, improvised instrument. He found solace in his cramped chamber, where he would sit for hours at a time and play the violin, not for enjoyment, but for the sake of his own survival. As much as it was a hobby, Angus found solace in music. The murmur of buzzing strings served as his protection in a world where childhood was battle. Instead of taking classes or reading manuals, he learned by doing, and he was hell-bent on keeping the outside world out of his life. When he was holding a guitar, the biting Glasgow winters, the empty tummy, and the fists at school vanished. Still, Angus Young was making something more than just a protective device, and he had no idea. He was molding the character that would rumble across arenas in due time. Angus Young was learning to fight back on the rough streets of Glasgow long before he became famous, AC/DC, or even known to the world. With no sound at all, playing 6 strings. However, as the icy streets of Glasgow started to warm up, Angus was on the verge of facing a different type of exile, one that wouldn't numb his hands, but would put his identity to the ultimate test. In 1963, the Young family made a choice driven by hopelessness and desperation. They departed from Glasgow's soot and steel in pursuit of Australia's sun-drenched promise. Government advertisements urged working-class families to seek a better life in the Southern Hemisphere that year, as one of the worst winters in Scotland history pounded down on already suffering families. William and Margaret Young were willing to put their fears of starting again aside in favor of the promise of better weather and more opportunities. In exchange for a more or less guaranteed future, they loaded their children and a few possessions onto a ship. Angus, an 8-year-old, was one of the youngest. He was too little to understand the magnitude of what was being abandoned, but he was old enough to experience the subsequent displacement. When the family finally reached Sydney, it was far from the ideal ending to their dream. They made their home in the Villawood Migrant Hostel, a makeshift shelter with steel bunk beds and communal bathrooms that would serve as a prison decades later. Hot in the summer, frigid in the winter, and completely lacking in privacy, those were just a few of the harsh aspects of life there. Angus found himself in a place where the language was unfamiliar. The traditions were strange, and he felt like an outsider even at a young age. If Glasgow had instilled in him the need to be tough, Sydney had shown him the ropes of stealth. He began to isolate himself, becoming more silent than usual, as he felt out of place among the unfamiliar people and unfamiliar clothing. But music returned as a thread of continuity, and eventually, change, within the cultural divide of migratory living. The Easy Beats were one of Australia's first breakout rock bands, formed by musical prodigy George Young and fellow Dutch migrant Harry Vanda, whom they encountered at the same hostel. Malcolm and Angus, who watched on from the sidelines while music provided an outlet, validation, and sense of agency, were energized by their accomplishments. Angus felt a profound change. It was more than just a spark. It was his green light. A chance to imagine a world where a star-studded team's unbridled ambitions and raw skill can conquer any obstacle. And a chance to escape the limitations that a poor immigrant youngster faces every day. Angus Young began to find his identity in Australia, not in the classrooms he attended, which he despised, but in the countless hours he spent strumming guitar. He began doing odd jobs to make ends meet after dropping out of school at the age of 15 due to his lack of interest in anything other than music and painting. On the other hand, he had become more focused and resilient as a result of his dislocation. The energy comes from the feeling of not fitting in. The shy, globe-trotting young guy now focused his maddening concentration on his guitar skills. Even while Australia was unprepared for Angus Young at first, it ultimately shaped him. Forge work transformed an immigrant kid from a forlorn soul into a world-shaking artist by melting away doubt and making insecurity passion. For the young siblings, music served as more than simply background noise. It was a unifying force, a language stronger than words spoken aloud. George, the oldest pioneer in music, and Malcolm, the reserved architect who would become Angus's creative collaborator for life, were two persons that stood out to him. After giving Angus a strung banjo, George subsequently praised his guitar skills. However, Angus's future was shaped not just by the music, but also by the mentality that Malcolm instilled in him as they stood side by side, riff after riff. In contrast to George's flamboyant energy, Malcolm gave structure, which Angus needed to counteract his wild theatrical appearance. It appeared as though Malcolm and Angus were born with a shared sense, which is unusual for brothers. They worked well together artistically. They could convey a change in chord, speed, or sudden burst of intensity with a glance alone. Thus, there was no need for words during rehearsal or performance. They had a close and complex connection. Angus's lead guitar soared off of Malcolm's rhythm guitar. Their combined efforts resulted in a sound that was more muscular than showy, with Malcolm playing the spine and Angus the scream. The two brothers who formed AC/DC didn't work for an established company or industry. Rather, they built the band from the bottom up. They started out as two adolescents in a seedy bedroom, chasing a sound with beat-up guitars and an unyielding will, long before they had platinum recordings and sold-out shows. Their sister Margaret is said to have seen the name AC/DC on a sewing machine, which led her to think of it. From that point on, their actions were deeply influenced by their family. More than any manager, critic, or producer, they trusted each other. Their devotion to the music and each other led to their fame, not the other way around. Despite facing loss, strain, and changing trends, the band's exceptional stability was given by this familial basis. As other bands disintegrated over vanity or corporate remake, Angus and Malcolm ensured that AC/DC remained true to their roots, playing loud, honest rock and roll. Their friendship was unbreakable even as their positions evolved. Malcolm stepped back in later years and eventually left due to sickness. The influence of Malcolm was evident in every riff Angus played, and the foundation of every solo was a rhythm they had created together many years ago. While most accounts of AC/DC's origins focus on the band's legendary records and meteoric rise to fame, the real narrative is that of two brothers, one loud and one quiet, who found the perfect contrast in each other. Without that union, AC/DC would not exist. When he was a teenager in the early 1970s, Angus Young was performing in Sydney's little clubs and halls as just another young guitarist. With no apparent future ahead of him, he had abandoned his education, worked odd jobs, and played in a string of minor bands. His life took a dramatic turn the night he and Malcolm decided to start a band, a high-energy, no-holds-barred outfit. After seeing the AC/DC label on a sewing machine, their sister Margaret suggested the moniker. The band AC/DC was unstoppable from their very first performance. They were already performing at a higher level than everybody else. They didn't require radio play or a sophisticated production. They compensated for their lack of fame with raw strength, thanks to Angus's relentless stage energy, ferocious guitars, and tight rhythms. Angus quickly learned the hard way that in a crowded music venue, artists required more than just good sound to stand out. They needed a striking visual presence that would leave an impression. A Spider-Man costume, a Zorro cloak, and even a fake superhero suit were among the theatrical garbs he experimented with. The schoolboy outfit, meanwhile, was the one that really took off. Another idea from Margaret. With his short shorts, hat, and tie, Angus became a visual paradox, a child playing music with the zeal of a lunatic. The appearance became popular when paired with his distinctive duck walk, which was a nod to Chuck Berry. With Bon Scott came the last missing element. The band's pyromaniac enthusiasm was well complemented by his gravely, gruff, and unrepentant voice. Bon was more likely to snarl, tease, and provoke than to sing. With Bon behind the microphone, AC/DC had found their voice, raw, unfiltered, and blatantly primal. Their goal was not to be sophisticated or innovative, but rather for their music to strike without leaving any aftertaste. TNT, High Voltage, and Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap were more than just songs. They were anthems for the outcasts, the people who didn't fit in, and the ones who were sick of smooth rock. Already a strong live band, AC/DC had earned their name outside of Australia via relentless touring, sweltering clubs, and performances that left it everything on stage. As if the notes he played were shocking him, Angus would thrash about the stage throughout each performance, which served as both an endurance test and an exhibition of showmanship. Rather of crashing through the music establishment, AC/DC assaulted it. When February 1980 rolled around, AC/DC were riding high on their biggest hit to that point. With Highway to Hell as their breakout hit, the band went from relative unknowns to global superstars, thanks to the wild and irresistible combination of Angus Young's explosive stage presence and Bon Scott's sneering vocals. Then, Out of nowhere, all activity came to a halt. After a night of heavy drinking, 33-year-old Bon Scott was discovered dead in a parked automobile. His life was cut suddenly, in an unexpected manner. The passing of a bandmate was tragic, but for Angus, it was the passing of a soulmate. Bon embodied more than just the band's vocals. He represented its confidence, spirit, and raw identity. Thanks to their shared love of music, their shared rejection of pretense, and their shared dedication to enjoying life to the fullest, the two had developed a profound, though sometimes unsaid, understanding. Following Bon's passing, Angus Young refrained from making any public remarks, interviews, or attempts to contextualize his grief. He retreated into his own private misery and disappeared from public view. This was an unusually quiet performance for a man whose guitar usually stole the show. Because Bon's departure left an insurmountable void, many assumed the band would disband. Angus and Malcolm, however, made a decision behind closed doors, not for fame but for honor, to carry on. According to Malcolm, Bon would have wanted us to go on. This wasn't a new beginning. It was a rebirth motivated by grief, rather than for chart reasons or to protect their momentum. As they entered the Bahamas studio to record Back in Black, lightning could be heard outside the window. The weather was terrible. Angus later said that was Bon opening the show from hell. He wasn't being figurative. The music seemed to be summoned out from a depth below creativity, a melancholy turned electrified atmosphere. The music of Back in Black seemed more fitting for a funeral than an album. Every song pulsated with the strength of grief and remembrance, from the opening tolling bells of Hell's Bells to the relentless, searing attack of the title track. Angus's riffs were more controlled and precise, yet they still managed to sting with emotion. Brian Johnson, who was unexpectedly brought in to replace Bon, didn't try to rebuild from the ground up. Instead, he injected his own fire while honoring the legacy Bon had left behind. The result was an album unlike any other rock record, loud, unfiltered, and haunted by ghosts. It burst into tears without either crying or breaking. Without really trying, Angus was able to say farewell to his friend. Back in Black's popularity went beyond mere commercial durability. It became the second best-selling record of all time. It proved that when art openly depicts loss, it communicates more than just personal sorrow. Angus Young had no intention of using Bon's death for personal gain or to turn him into a martyr. Instead, he continued to bring him along for every solo, performance, and duck walk through the squawking throng. Though it failed to resurrect AC/DC, Bon became immortal, not in solemnity but in whole-volume tribute, thanks to the album. Furthermore, it exposed a hitherto unseen aspect of Angus, a man who, instead of withdrawing, amps up his music in the face of tragedy. In the early 2000s, something fundamental about AC/DC started to fall apart. Not in the spotlight, not due to controversy or abrupt disbandment, but due to something far more terrible: Malcolm Young's gradual absence. Malcolm started to lose touch with the music that had shaped his life after being diagnosed with early-onset dementia. A missing chord or a forgotten phrase may not have seemed like a big deal at the time, but they added up to a steady slide. Witnessing the gradual fading away of half of his life's work and soul was more than simply a bandmate battling an illness. It was a personal tragedy for Angus Young. Behind AC/DC's booming sound, Malcolm has always been the steadying influence. He was Angus's unwavering support and rhythmic foundation, and he never sought recognition or appreciation for his efforts. And now, gradually, he was deteriorating. Not because Angus's pain at the time wasn't real, but because he refrained from discussing it, the world never knew about it. Instead of sharing updates or venting in interviews, Angus chose to stay mute, allowing himself to feel helpless. It seemed as if Malcolm were being slowly but surely lost as I saw him change. Words and melodies that had before flowed effortlessly now posed occasional challenges for the guy who had once held entire songs in his line of sight. Dementia is particularly cruel since, unlike other diseases, it doesn't take a person's life but rather their identity. They didn't choose their nephew Stevie Young to replace Malcolm in the band. They needed him. Malcolm quit the band in 2014. Still, every chord and practice was shrouded in Malcolm's shadow. Angus kept his schoolboy appearance and continued to shred riffs on stage, but he grew quieter and more reserved when he wasn't. Unlike Bon Scott's sudden death, this one was gradual, silent, and harder to comprehend. No elaborate memorial service or eulogy was held following Malcolm's 2017 death. The one statement that Angus delivered, "Losing Malcolm felt like I lost an arm," said it all. His quiet, unvarnished grief screamed more than any homage could. It was raw, intense, and to the bone. It wasn't acting. Power Up, which was never intended to relaunch anything, it was supposed to finish something divine, was made 3 years later in 2020 by Angus and the other members of AC/DC in the studio. On the album, Malcolm left his mark on every single song, riff, and word. His influence could be felt in the record's tone and structure, which reflected his tastes, as well as in the riffs he had left behind, even if he didn't have a vocal appearance. Silently, in a neighborhood of Western Sydney, a catastrophe occurred in late December 2024. Not one that made headlines or claimed lives, but one that erased history altogether. Construction workers in Burwood were oblivious to the cultural importance of the little inconspicuous cottage that the Young family had resided in after emigrating from Scotland. The property was located at 4 Burleigh Street. As part of a $28 million rehabilitation effort, it was only another dilapidated building in their eyes. However, it was holy ground for millions of AC/DC fans throughout the globe. Angus and Malcolm Young spent their formative years in that humble house, where the acoustics of their first instruments reverberated through the thin walls, and the foundations of what would later become a legendary rock legacy began to take shape. It was leveled to ruin without any prior notice, just another victim of development. A rapid and angry response ensued. A flood of shocked and outraged fans flooded message boards, social media, and news articles. There was more to this structure than meets the eye. It served as a physical memorial to a cultural phenomenon and a sacred place for devoted AC/DC fans. On one wall, a painting depicting the Young brothers, created a few months earlier, served as a visual reminder of where their music had come from. Despite the lack of legal protection provided by the home's entry on the National Trust Register of Historic Houses, the house has still been preserved. The property was razed without public notification, despite its recorded heritage, after it had secretly changed hands. For some, it was a tragic loss for global music culture as well as Australian rock history. There was a period when a city rejected its own mythology without realizing it had done so. Burwood Square Pty Limited, the construction company, issued a public apology in the days that followed, admitting that the prior owner had failed to convey the historical significance of the land. Acknowledging the significance of this location to AC/DC fans and the global community, they expressed their sincere apologies. They promised to preserve as much of the original elements as possible and provide a memorial space for fans as a token of their sorrow for the irretrievable loss. The events in Burwood represent a global struggle between preservation and modernization. They are more than just a local planning gaffe. More generally, the burning of the Young brothers' home begs the question of how society treats places that house works of art, especially those that lack the formality of museums or the grandeur of monuments. Angus Young, who is known for his seclusion, chose not to address the event publicly. Maybe it wasn't necessary for him to. His lifelong expressions of silent, searing sorrow over Bon, Malcolm, and the walls that once contained their early hopes resonated with the silence around the loss. Once Angus Young duck walks across stadia to the thunder of tens of thousands, he is practically unrecognizable off stage. He may be one of the last wild rock stars, thrilling crowds in the same battered schoolboy uniform for decades, but his personal life is far more subdued. No crazy parties, scandals, or entourage characterize Angus's life as a famous person. He has never partakes in intoxicating narcotics, does not drink, and has little interest in the rock star lifestyle that engulfed his contemporaries. Rather of embracing the commotion of the spotlight, he sticks to his introverted nature and enjoys spending time with his wife Ellen in peace and quiet at home. Angus has shown extraordinary discipline in his life, which is almost defiant given that his profession is based on excess. His calculated withdrawal from the limelight is a measure of self-preservation, not a sign of mystique. Unlike modern celebrities, Angus has never used social media and has never participated in the stage-managed oversharing that characterizes this industry. Rarely does he give interviews, and when he does, his opinions are brief and reserved, revealing little beyond his love of music. He has always let his music speak for itself, rather than trying to build a public persona via the use of sound bites or media placements. The paradoxical impact of Angus's near-total seclusion has been to further solidify the myth surrounding him in a society where being visible at all times is seen to be essential to staying relevant. Being reserved has only served to heighten the impact of his eventual appearance on stage, guitar in hand. Disconcerting and illuminating is the contrast between his public character and his actual personality. While off stage, Angus finds solace in his daily routine and vivid imagination. He finds peace and quiet at his homes in Glasgow, Alton, and Sydney, where he paints with oil and listens to old jazz albums, especially those by Louis Armstrong. Reflecting his simplicity and abstinence, the house he lives with Ellen in the Netherlands is a privacy-oriented dwelling with a private music room, a library room, and an underused wine cellar. He used to be the one who sounded the insurrection, but now he lives a life of near monastic peace. Instead of amassing headlines, he amasses time. Time to write, think, and be human without the filter of fame. This modest way of living is more than just a character quirk. It's a philosophical framework. Music, in Angus's view, should always be an act of authenticity rather than commercialization. Angus persisted in his music even while scores of his contemporaries sought stardom, rebranded themselves, or staged nostalgic comebacks. Dedicated only to himself, his brother, the faithful followers who have stuck with him through thick and thin, and the unwavering rhythm that has never left him. After stepping away from the limelight, he has, for some reason, become even more enduring. Both the riffs he plays and the life he leads in the background are part of Angus Young's legacy, proving once again that the most legendary figures are often the ones who keep quiet and allow their body of work do the talking. Angus Young remained pat in an industry that was all about innovation, and that, in a way, made him enduring. Angus stubbornly stuck to what he knew, even when other rock icons experimented with different styles, changed their looks, or followed the latest fads. Consistent explosive stage intensity, identical Gibson SG guitar, and identical schoolboy costume. The essence of his musical persona remained constant during the years 1977 to 1930. He always believed that the strength of AC/DC's music rested in its unadulterated simplicity. Therefore, there was no need for them to evolve to be relevant. To Angus, change meant giving in, while to others, it meant progress. "They say we've made the same record 12 times," Angus would joke. "And they're wrong. We've made it 13. What others would call repetition, he would embrace as dedication. And critics would often accuse AC/DC of doing just that. There was no need to tone it down or sugarcoat it, in Angus's opinion, if it worked. If it stirred people, inspired crowds, and stayed true to its roots. Not complicated tests, but raw instruments of power were his riffs. Refusing to acknowledge the transient nature of modern music, that decision to stay the course was a revolt in and of itself. A steady Angus was a rare gem in a world where novelty, branding, and rapid virality rule supreme. He was the image, not the one looking for one. The uniform of the schoolboys was an assertion, not a mask. Rock and roll didn't need to reinvent themselves to be relevant. It was a declaration that youth is eternal. It wasn't hubris, but principle, that made me refuse to update. His followers knew they could always count on him for real, unvarnished rock, devoid of gloss and gimmick, because he never traded authenticity for coolness. He was never one to seek popularity at the expense of his legacy, but he did follow something far heavier. Angus Young still rocks the stage at 70 years old, as if he had something to say. Without any kind of backing music, gimmicks, or extended breaks, he continues to do whole 2-hour concerts in city after city. Angus continues to duck walk, sweat, and shred his way through every event as if it were his first, even though most of his peers have cut back or retired entirely. He shows no signs of slowing down, not because he is trying to beat the clock, but because he is utterly confused about how to be. Instead of becoming a habit, performing is a ritual for him, one that values the music and the people who attend live performances equally. The lack of effort he has put into creating or telling his own tale is a contributing factor to Angus's longevity. Nothing has been announced regarding a solo record, a tell-all book, or a nostalgic farewell tour. Because, in his view, AC/DC was superfluous, he's never really stepped out of their shadow. He has always stuck to his original style and has never sought to change in order to fit in with the times. He let the music carry him as he just kept performing and making appearances. In today's world, when most careers are built on constant self-promotion and innovation, this quiet consistency is a rare kind of commitment. We read every comment, so if this story touched you, please share your feelings by clicking the like button. If you want to hear about more obscure rock legends and stories, make sure to subscribe. If you're still interested, you should see the video that appears next. It's a must-see.